Well, here we are, and I'd like to welcome you to the first of these era review lectures. It's the last I'm recording, but it's the first chronologically, the 1200 to 1450 time period review lecture. We have, in our course of our class this year, been calling this the pre-modern era, and it is. I think this is widely regarded as being before the start of modern world history in the 1400s and 1500s, which begins with globalization. But the College Board included this part as part of our course, I think, quite wisely, as sort of a setting the stage for everything else that came afterwards in our modern era of world history. So we get to learn about this little snatch of pre-modern history too as part of our class, which I certainly enjoyed doing with you all in the fall. And I'm certainly going to enjoy doing a little review with you all here right now as well of this 1200 to 1450 time period, the pre-modern era. The College Board actually describes two units of study in this time period that we did way back in the fall. The global tapestry, sort of a visit to various important societies and in regions of the world and seeing what was going on there in the time period before the 15th century, and networks of exchange, also studying the ways in which these different societies and regions of the world were already interconnected and exchanging culture, technology, goods, diseases in the time period before true globalization. So keep those ideas in mind, I would say, as we begin our study. The College Board is wanting you to both keep in mind the important developments, the ways that different parts of the world were developing, what was going on there already by the 15th century, and the way that these different parts of the world were interacting with each other. Yellow has been our color for this era, and I think it's good for us to stop and remember why that is. This is hopefully a helpful way to remember things. So let's remember that yellow does play an important role in this time period. Maybe it's the yellow sands of the Arabian desert, out of which came Islam, the most important new religious movement of this era, or the yellow deserts of or yellow sands of the Sahara Desert, across which the trans-Saharan trade networks extended, connecting West Africa to the Mediterranean world. Here you're seeing a picture of the yellow grasslands of the Eurasian steppes, that sort of belt of dryish, semi-arid grasslands, or steppes to use an old word for them, that extend all the way from East Asia to Europe, passing through Central Asia along the way, and through which the Silk Road trade routes largely passed as well, connecting East Asia to Central Asia to the Mediterranean and Europe. And also, too, the Eurasian steppes is where you find Mongolia. And the Mongols, of course, a key set of players in this time period, as we shall see. So let's remember the yellow grasslands of the Eurasian steppes, important in world history here as well. We know, too, that in this time period, gold was both a valuable trade good, gold from West Africa, for example, traded across the trans-Saharan trade routes, gold from East Africa shipped out on the Indian Ocean trade networks on dhows, but also not just a trade commodity, but gold coinage too, one of the key forms of currency in this era before it becomes silver currency in the next era. So that's important. Let's see, what else is yellow? Well, we shouldn't leave out the Americas, should we? Because there are millions of people unfolding their own part of human history in the Americas in this time period before the voyages of Columbus, and many of them relied on maize or corn with its yellow kernels to feed themselves and to feed their society. So just a few things of yellow here to remember. It's always good to pay attention to the big stories in each era. Each era has 3 or 4 big stories that you want to pay attention to, and 80% of the time your DBQ prompt is going to point you to one of these big stories as the context of your essay. So knowing these are for the contextualization of your essay is a good thing to do. So let's know the big stories of this era. Here are the official College Board versions: a deepening and widening of networks of human interaction within and across regions contributed to cultural, technological, and biological diffusion within and between various societies. This is that networks of exchange big story. State formation and development demonstrated continuity, innovation, and diversity in various regions. This links to that global tapestry big story from the College Board, the idea that in this time period, all kinds of states and societies were developing in different parts of the world in different ways in this time period. And we're kind of back to the first story. The third big story here echoes the first story. Changes in trade networks resulted from and stimulated increasing productive capacity, with important implications for social and gender structures and environmental processes. So what are the effects of increasing trade and communication between regions in Afro-Eurasia and to a certain extent in the Americas in this time period? I think it's kind of handy sometimes to simplify the big stories a little bit, so we'll do that. The first one, I think, simplifies to interregional interaction intensifies, meaning there's more cultural, technological, and ecological sharing of things that come from nature, whether it's crops, whether it's agricultural products, or whether it's germs that came from our natural ecology. And then the abbreviation for the second point there, different kinds of states and societies form in different places. There's that global tapestry theme. And third, production of goods changed and increased. This is what we're going to be paying attention to as we take a tour here of the world in the pre-modern era, 1200 to 1450. And I think that if you've already watched the 1450 to 1750 time period, you know, in that period I had a picture of the era, that image of Hernan Cortez arriving in Tenochtitlan, the picture of the era. Here is a place where I think we could propose nominating a person of the era, one individual who embodies both the interregional connections of this time period and the different societies developing different parts of the world, someone who could kind of tie all those things together for us. And people have suggested to me, students have suggested to me over the years, different people of the era for this time period. Chinggis Khan often gets a worthy nomination, but I'd say there's someone who even more embodies what this era was all about, because this person traveled even more distantly and widely around the world than Chinggis Khan did. So I would like to nominate as person of the era, of course, this guy, Abd Muhammad ibn Battuta, our world famous traveler. We spent some time with him back in October. We're going to spend some time with him once again. This guy is pretty remarkable because, as you recall, in the time period before any form of motorized travel, when travel meant relying on the wind or muscles, either yours or an animal's, to move from place to place, in a time before cars and trains, let alone airplanes, as this map shows us, this dude traveled 75,000 miles around the world in the course of his 30 years, 3 decades of travel in the 1300s. And you can see on the map here, on the green arrows, the widespread nature of his travels. Ibn Battuta, throughout most regions of Afro-Eurasia there, he traveled to, well, he was from North Africa, traveled to the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Africa, West Africa, East Asia, and Europe before he was all done. So that's pretty remarkable. There's another guy whose travels are highlighted there too, and I think we might count him perhaps as our runner-up for person of the era. Another pretty impressive traveler, Marco Polo, though he did not travel quite as widely as Ibn Battuta. Marco Polo never really traveled in Africa at all. But let's remind ourselves, why is Abdallah ibn Battuta such a great embodiment of this era? Well, first of all, he was a devout Muslim in what's often described as the golden age of Islam. During this time period, there were probably more followers of Islam than any other religion on earth. Islam, of course, was one of the world's dominant civilizations, so widespread, connecting everywhere from Southeast Asia to Spain, and from Central Asia all the way down the east coast of Africa. And Ibn Battuta traveled those whole realms. I think it's fairly noticeable to note that in his 75,000 miles of travel throughout 8 regions of the world, only very rarely was he outside of a place where Islam was a dominant part of the civilization, either followed by most people or followed by the ruling elites. It was a world of Islam at that time, and he traveled all the way through it. And he was an astute observer of some of the world's most important civilizations of this time period. Yuan dynasty China, the Delhi Sultanate in South Asia, the Byzantine Empire in Europe, the Seljuk Turkish kingdoms that took over much of the Middle East after the collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate about 100 years before Ibn Battuta's time, Western Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, so many of the places that we need to know about for our course were visited and described very well by Ibn Battuta. And I say described very well because, as you know, because you read some of it in the fall, he wrote about all of his travels in this book that you can see here at the right, The Travels of Ibn Battuta, also known as the Rilha. And in fact, so much that we know today about this era comes to us from the accounts left by Ibn Battuta. So that's pretty impressive. But I would note that Marco Polo is a solid runner-up. Marco Polo also embodying some of the important traits and aspects of this entire era. Marco Polo, of course, the famous Venetian traveler from Venice in Italy. You can see a page of his manuscripts there on the right. He was a merchant in an age of trade. Unlike Ibn Battuta, who originally left home to go on his pilgrimage, the Hajj to Mecca, Marco Polo left home to do what many others did in this time period, to trade in the company of his father and his uncle. He wound up becoming an official in the Mongol government of China, thereby helping facilitate the rule of the most important and vastest single political entity of this time period. In fact, the world's biggest empire ever until modern times, that vast Mongol empire. He helped make it work as a Mongol official in China. And just like Ibn Battuta, at the end of his travels, he wrote it all down. And once again, many of the sources of information, much of what we know about much of Eurasia in this time period, also comes from the travel accounts of Marco Polo in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, in Central Asia, and in East Asia during this time period. So we'll call Marco Polo the runner-up, and he also got some good mention there on that map. So we'll kind of be following throughout this review lecture the travels of these two gentlemen, Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo, as they travel the world. And we'll kind of start out here in what we really can't describe as a region. I mean, as we see on the map here, the lands in which Islam was an important part of life and society embodied 9 different regions of the world here: Europe, Central Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, West Africa, East Asia, Southeast Asia. Okay, that's 8. 8 regions of the world here. So much so that historians have coined this term, or resurrected this term of the time, Dar al-Islam, which the College Board is using too this year. Dar al-Islam, basically meaning the realms of Islam, or the home of Islam, or to put it broadly, the Islamic world, that vast swath of Afro-Eurasia where Islam and Islamic civilization was a key part of life. So take a look here at the map here at the vast stretch of Dar al-Islam, because all the purple and yellow and orange and pink areas on this map are the parts of the world where in our time period, 1200 to 1450, Islam was a big, important deal. And we're actually going to kind of start out, even though it's not a region, it encompasses so many regions, we're going to kind of start out in Dar al-Islam, this central civilization of the world in the 1200 to 1450 time period, to take a look at this world here, this part of the world, and this Islamic civilization. So just like Ibn Battuta, born into the Dar al-Islam in Morocco, in North Africa, we're going to begin our tour here in the Islamic world. Which means, of course, that there's a belief system to know. And the College Board does care about you knowing the key belief systems of world history and introduces them to us too in this section of our course. So throughout this review lecture, you'll be seeing some reminders sprinkled throughout of the key belief systems to know. Here's our first one, not chronologically, but in importance for this era, Islam. So let's start with Islam there and remind ourselves that the origins of Islam lie about 600 years before the beginning of our era with the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad in and around the city of Mecca and Arabia, around the year 600 CE. Of course, according to Islamic traditions, Muhammad was the last in a long line of prophets of God, stretching all the way back to Moses and before. But he was the last of the prophets who brought the final revelation, God's final message to humanity, which is this: that there is just one God, a strictly monotheistic God, and that you honor this one God through adherence to the 5 pillars, these core practices of Islam, that God's words were revealed his teachings were revealed, God's teachings were revealed through Muhammad in the Quran, the holy text of Islam, and that all people are called to submit. Islam means submission, to submit to God and follow God 100%. It's a universal religion. It does apply to everybody, a missionary religion. Everyone is entreated to join this religion, and it does have some pretty core practices to follow too. Those 5 pillars: the giving of charity, zakat, the pilgrimage to Mecca once in your lifetime if you're able to, the Hajj, the fast during Ramadan, which is happening right now in May. The prayer 5 times a day, and the simple declaration, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. Of course, Allah is the same God worshipped by Jews and Christians. There's a key link between these 3 religions. Judaism and Christianity, they are in fact called Abrahamic religions, as you'll recall, in honor of the prophet Abraham, often recognized as the first follower of one true God. So there's a key linkage here between these religions, now followed by a majority of humans alive on Earth. Where do we find this in the 1200 to 1450 time period? Well, as that map shows, once again, this is a pretty important factor in of the world: the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Europe, West Africa, and East Africa, all places where Islam is important, by far the world's most widespread religion in this time period. But while we're on the topic of Abrahamic religions, it is important also to understand the first of these, even though it's a tiny minority of the world's population in the 1200 to 1450 time period and today. As the first of the 3 Abrahamic religions, Judaism does have a pretty important place in world history. This is, of course, far before the beginnings of our choice, the origins of Judaism among the beliefs of the Hebrew people of the Middle East, modern-day Israel/Palestine, about 4,000 years ago. Judaism is about 4,000 years old. That script that you see on the right is a version of the Torah, the holy text of Judaism, that's about 2,000 years old, showing you that it's an old religion. The key beliefs, of course, this is also a monotheistic religion, but it's quite a bit different, I should say, than Islam in being an ethnic religion. And AP Human Geography students will remember that means a religion into which you are born, not universal. The belief is that the Jews, the Hebrew people, were God's chosen people, and he didn't choose just anybody to be able to come join the religion. So traditional Judaism is an ethnic religion, and obviously if you have to be born into it, there's no sense in it being a missionary religion either. And that does kind of explain why Judaism has remained a small minority religion in most parts of the world for the last 4,000 years. But an important one in helping launch the other 2 much larger Abrahamic religions. And of course, Jews play an important role in many societies throughout world history, as we shall see even on our tour today. Where were Jewish communities? As I mentioned, there wasn't really anywhere in the world where Jews were a majority of the population in our time period. However, there were key minority communities of Jews, especially in the Middle East and in Europe in this time period, and we'll run into them again in a little bit, partly as a result of the diaspora, or the spreading out of Jews from the original homeland of the Hebrews around the city of Jerusalem, throughout the Middle East and North Africa and Europe and beyond, for a variety of factors, including the Roman defeat of the Jewish rebellion about 2,000 years ago. So that's an important religion and belief system to know. Now, remember that before our time period, much of the Muslim world had been earlier unified under the rule of a massive empire called the Abbasid Caliphate. Caliphate, remember, comes from the word Khalif, which means a successor or deputy. You'll recall that when Muhammad died in the year 632 CE, the community elected a successor, someone to take over the leadership of the Muslim community of people and what had already become a pretty big Muslim state in Arabia following the death of Muhammad, and that his successors first the four rightly guided caliphs, and then the Umayyad dynasty who took over from them, claimed this title of Caliph, to be a successor of Muhammad, to be both the religious leader of all Muslims of the world and the political leader of the new Islamic empire that launched even during the lifetime of Muhammad. Now, the Umayyad Caliphate, or the Islamic Caliphate that came first, did a massive job of conquering much of the Middle East and North Africa and into South and Central Asia and into Europe too. But about 100 years later, around the year 750 or so, that dynasty was overthrown. They were overthrown by the Abbasid dynasty that ruled this slightly smaller, but still massive, biggest yet in world history, green empire shown here. That, though, even that event in the year 750 was 500 years before the beginning of our time period, by which point this massive original Islamic caliphate and the Abbasid caliphate that came after it had begun to break apart. It had fragmented. And this map here shows that how all those colored areas that had once been part of the Abbasid caliphate were now ruled by other states, successor states, most of which were dominated by Turkic people. Remember, Turkic people in Central Asia had been earlier adopters of Islam, and then because Central Asia, I guess, is kind of lame, they had used their military skills and their newfound religious fervor to launch invasions out of Central Asia, taking over parts of other neighboring regions, including the Middle East. So as the Abbasid Caliphate fell apart and was taken over bit by other smaller states, a lot of those successor states were ruled by Turks. Look, the Seljuk Turks of Rum, they took over that purple chunk and made it the Seljuk of Rum Kingdom. The Seljuk Turks, the regular ones, took over the red chunk there, launching the Seljuk Empire, a much smaller chunk of what was once the Abbasid Caliphate. Let's see, we got more Turks there, the Ghaznavids that took over that chunk of the empire too. And we'll see those Turks reappearing in South Asia too, starting the Delhi Sultanate. But it's kind of important to remember the once by our time period, it's important to remember there had been this one Islamic empire, the Abbasid Caliphates, and that by our time it had fallen apart into different chunks, many of them ruled by invading Turks from Central Asia. So remember that, the fragmentation of the Abbasid Caliphates. Let's see. But, of course, Islam, the religion and the civilization, even as the Abbasid Caliphate fell apart in the centuries leading up to the 1200s, Islam itself expanded quite a bit beyond the boundaries of the old Abbasid Caliphate, covering those areas we've already seen. This is the third time this map has made its appearance in our review. Part of it was related to military expansion. You'll recall just a moment ago my mention of the Turks who left Central Asia and invaded South Asia, taking Islam there, establishing an Islamic kingdom or Islamic state in northern India, the Delhi Sultanate. So that was a case of Islam and Islamic rule expanding because of military expansion. And many other parts of the world, though, it was a much more peaceful process too, where merchants, Islamic merchants, Muslim merchants traveling to new lands, and missionaries, often Sufis, those guys who believed in a much more spiritual and much less rule-bound version of Islam, traveled to new lands and through their teaching and their example convinced people there to adopt this new faith. And so in most of the regions Islam spread to, that was the reason for the expansion. It was merchants and missionaries who brought Islam to Southeast Asia, where it had gained a foothold by the year 1450. It was merchants and some Sufis who spread Islam to Central Asia, converting those Turkic people in the first place. It was merchants and missionaries who brought it to West Africa and to East Africa as well, where Islam became a religion followed typically by the elite minority in our time period. So a couple, 2-3 reasons you got to keep in mind about or for the expansion of Islam in our time period. And covering so much of the Earth's surface and interconnected by trade routes, by the practice of the Hajj, of people traveling from all over the world to meet up in Mecca every single year. The realm of Islam, the Islamic world, Dar al-Islam, had the capability to become the realm of significant long-distance intellectual innovations and transfers. I mean, the fact that most Muslims had some acquaintance with the Arabic language, whether they lived in Sumatra or Spain, also helped to make the spread of ideas around this massive part of the world easier. So let's look at some of these intellectual innovations and transfers, because in a lot of cases, Muslim scholars, Muslim scientists, Muslim doctors, Muslim engineers came up with new intellectual innovations, new ideas. Here's just one good example: the idea of how to clear cataracts out of your eye. Medical care took a lot of steps forward thanks to the innovations of Muslim scientists and physicians. Algebra, too. Not only was it an invention of the Muslim world of this time period, algebra itself is an Arabic word that we still use today. However, too, the Muslim scholars of Dar al-Islam of this time period were also masters of acquiring the best of earlier scholarship and knowledge and transferring it all around their vast realm and beyond. And speaking of math, you can see here in this textbook written by the great Muslim mathematician Al-Tusi, you can see how Muslim scholars transmitted to new places ideas of classical Greek, in this case the Pythagorean theorem, and Indian, like the use of what we now call Arabic numerals, mathematical ideas to new places. And just one key example of this that we looked at in our class is Al-Andalus, the Arabic name for the Iberian Peninsula where Portugal and Spain are, where during this time period the Christian world of Western Europe and the Muslim world, because it was ruled by Muslims, at least partly in this time period, met and in a sense overlapped. And much of the scholarship from the classical Greek world that came to Western Europe in our time period came through Al-Andalus, came through Muslim-ruled Spain into Western Europe and into Western European knowledge. So that's important to remember. So let's take a look as we move through Dar al-Islam and beyond with Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta. Let's look at the trade routes they traveled on. And the College Board really wants you to know the 4 major trade routes, traveling routes of the Afro-Eurasian world in this 1200 to 1450 time period. So let's make sure you remember. The Silk Roads, the great overland trade networks connecting East Asia and South Asia and the Mediterranean world, all connecting through Central Asia. They want you to remember as well the Indian Ocean trade networks, the sea roads, powered there by the monsoon winds connecting Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and East Africa. And some scholars kind of say, well, and in fact, all the way to East Asia, the sea roads connected. They want you to remember the trans-Saharan trade networks of this time period, connecting West African societies to the Mediterranean across the vast Sahara Desert. And they want you to remember the Mediterranean trade networks connecting Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa with seaborne trade around the Mediterranean Sea there. So those are all trade routes that Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta traveled on. Marco Polo did not travel on the trans-Saharan trade routes. Ibn Battuta did. Otherwise, both of those guys had extensive travels on all 3 of those trade routes. How did they travel, though? It's good to keep this in mind, too. Why was travel increasing in this time period? Well, one of the things that helped them travel, especially on the Silk Roads and the Trans-Saharan trade network, were camel saddles, a relatively new technology that made these beasts able to traverse deserts and arid terrain rideable and usable for transportation of goods, too. So camel saddle, a key technology of our time period. I'm not sure if you'd call this a technology or what, but it sure made travel easier. Yup. It's a caravanserai, the sort of motel of the pre-modern era there, which the proliferation of which across especially the Silk Road and North African trade routes made travel and trade much easier for the merchants, who could count on having a place pretty regularly throughout their travels where they could refresh their animals, where they could rest up, where they could stay safely for the night. Caravanserai, a key part of promoting travel and trade in this time period. We all know what that is with that Latin sail. It's a dhow. pushed by those regular, reliable, seasonable monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean, which people had been using for centuries as a way to get reliably around from place to place, from South Asia to the Middle East, from the Middle East to East Africa, all around the Indian Ocean. But in our time period too, added to these age-old technologies of the dhow and the monsoon winds are some newer technologies, like that thing, the astrolabe, a device invented by clever Muslim astronomers that enables people to see where they are, north and south on the Earth, by using the location of known stars. So that, of course, knowing where you are north and south certainly makes travel a lot easier. What would they have traveled with in those caravans, on those dhows? What would Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo traveled alongside? Well, goods, of course. Goods like textiles, silk from China, cotton from India, porcelain, mostly from East Asia, would have been a thing they would have traveled with, a commodity. Spices, peppers from South Asia, coriander and cinnamon from Southeast Asia. And you'll notice there's a commonality here with all of these things, because in this time period when travel was still much more difficult than today, if you were traveling long distances, you wanted to make sure to maximize the profit you would get from selling your goods when you arrived, wherever you arrived. And so there was an unwillingness to travel with anything that wasn't pretty valuable. That's why all of these trade goods were luxury goods, many of which produced by Chinese, Persian in the Middle East, and Indian artisans. So think about the Chinese artisans producing silk cloth and porcelain ceramics, the Indian artisans producing cotton cloths, the Persian artisans producing those valuable rugs and blankets that even today we call Persian rugs. So all those luxury goods produced by those artisans in those key areas. How would they have paid their way? Because of course Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo would have had to pay for their night's stay at a caravanserai, would have paid for their passage on board a dhow. And fortunately for them, this 1200 to 1450 time period brought to the world some new ways of paying, easier than carrying around bags of coin, which of course people still did. But there were these newer ways too, new forms of money, like paper money from China or flying money. Here is some 14th paper money from China to remind you of the new growing role of this easy to transport currency. New forms of credit like checks, invented originally in the Muslim world. So you don't have to carry money at all. You can just carry around this piece of paper that says, I'll pay you this money when you cash your check. That, of course, made travel a lot easier as well. They have these new forms of credits. What technologies would they have traveled with? In other words, what technological ideas were spreading with people like Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta as they traveled these great trade routes of the pre-modern 1200 to 1450 world? Well, some key examples of spreading technology come to us from China. And generally, this is the pattern of this time period. Technological ideas generally spreading from east to west. And our two go-to examples of this, I would say, are the technologies of paper making and gunpowder. Both developed in China, paper making 1,000 years before our time period, and gunpowder right at the beginning of our time period, that are then picked up by people in the Muslim world and eventually transferred to people in Europe as well. So by the end of this era, paper is being used widely throughout the world, and gunpowder is about to become an important form of weaponry in the world as well. In fact, some people are already using gunpowder to great military effect before the end of this era, as you can see here. What would they have eaten, Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, as they traveled the world of the 1200 to 1450 time period? Well, in a lot of parts of the world, they could have enjoyed this. Yup, it's champa rice. That rice first grown in Southeast Asia, but which in our time period spread to East Asia, which is very hearty, can grow in all kinds of environments, and greatly increase the food supply in East Asia, which is why people want champa, champa, champa on their rice, rice, rice. This is another crop that was becoming increasingly widespread in this time period throughout Afro-Eurasia. Sugar here, as you see, and also citrus fruits first domesticated in South Asia, become much more widespread by the year 1450 as their cultivation spreads throughout the Muslim world and beyond. Again, crops and farming techniques, along with medical knowledge and math and classical philosophy, were ideas that spread readily throughout the Muslim world. Bananas, originally from Southeast Asia, spread throughout Southeast Asia and become popular in East Africa too. So maybe they would have had some good bananas if they'd stopped in there. This represents something that historians have often described as the globalization and southernization of agriculture. A lot of crops, champa rice and sugar, for example, spreading from southern regions of the world to northern regions in Afro-Eurasia. So some important spread of crops along the trade routes to be aware of too. But not everything that spread along the trade routes, as we know, was tasty and beneficial to humans. What germs would they have traveled with? We know from our own experience of the last 6 months how much travel can promote the spread of germs. The same was quite true back in the 14th century, for example, when the Black Death, one of the world's deadliest epidemics, far worse than the COVID-19 we're dealing with today, spread along the trade routes. Historians aren't even 100% sure where it began. East Asia, maybe. Central Asia, maybe. But certainly by the 1340s, this Black Death pandemic had traveled along the trade routes and infected many parts of the world. There's that gruesome picture there from Europe from the time of the Black Plague. Historians today are pretty sure it was probably a mix of the bubonic plague, which is spread by fleas, with some anthrax thrown in there and probably some other diseases as well. But the combination was a deadly pestilence that killed millions in East Asia, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the people in China, in South Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, where, again, about 1/3 of the population died, 1 out of 3 people. And of course, you can't sustain as a society that level of death without some major changes. In Europe, we see that the feudal system, which we'll get to in a little bit, was actually somewhat weakened by the Black Plague. The system of exploitation of peasants by the aristocracy, by the landlords, wasn't as sustainable when there were fewer peasants to do the work, for example, and they could therefore demand more rights and more money in return for doing the work. So a lot of changes that came because of the Black Plague. And as they traveled, Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, what sort of places would they have stayed? Caravanserais, yes, but where would they have stayed for longer periods of time? Well, of course, they would have stayed in places like this, the trade cities of the 1200 to 1450 time period, which of course is where the trade routes connected and ended. Now, these trade cities, as you recall, are often the home of diasporic communities of merchants, people who have traveled, or their ancestors have traveled from other places but settled in small communities in these trade cities, largely to be merchants there. You'll perhaps remember from back in October reading that letter from a Jewish merchant traveling in India back home to sending letters back home to his wife in Cairo, and describing, among other things, how he has found other communities of Jewish merchants living there in India, continuing to practice Judaism, introducing, in fact, Judaism to India a little bit, diasporic communities of merchants. But there's lots of these. Ibn Battuta, for example, stayed among the Arab Muslim merchants of Quanzhou in southern China, a diasporic community of Muslim merchants he found there in China. And all the trade routes were laced with these communities of merchants living in other lands, but kind of continuing their own cultures and introducing a little bit of their own culture to those new lands too. So here's just some final reminder of this. Jewish traders in Europe, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, Muslims in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, diasporic communities of merchants. This trade city here happens also to be the capital city of the Byzantine Empire, that lasting remnant of the Roman Empire. That is Constantinople that you see there portrayed. And it's good for you to know, I think, besides Constantinople, it's good to have in mind a couple examples of powerful new trading cities here and there, maybe 2 to remember, since we have mentioned already a lot the Silk Roads and the Indian Ocean trade networks. Probably good to remember Samarkand in Central Asia on the Silk Roads as a good go-to example of a trading city. There is the Great Mosque in Samarkand, built in the early 1400s with the wealth generated from trade in Samarkand. And Malacca is a good go-to trade city in Southeast Asia, one of the Indian Ocean Trade Network trade cities, because by the 1400s, the trade passing through Malacca had given enough wealth to the local rulers that they were able to build this giant wooden palace that you can see here to live in. And in fact, Malacca wasn't just a single trade city. It also became the capital of a Muslim-ruled state, the Sultanate of Malacca, a state that grew because of its control of trade there in the Straits of Malacca, maritime trade in the Indian Ocean. Now, it wasn't all hunky-dory for cities all the time in this time period. This was a time period where some cities declined. Look, there's the Russian city of Ryazan in the process of declining. Can you guess why that city is declining? Yep, that's right. It's the Mongols. So sometimes cities suffer decline because of invasions, and a lot of cities, Beijing in China, Ryazan in Russia, Kiev in what's now Ukraine, suffered decline because of Mongol invasions and them torching the places. Other times cities decline because of disease. The bubonic plague, the Black Death, took its toll on urban life, at least for a short time too. However, in general, in this 1200 to 1450 time period, the general big trend of urbanization as a big deal in human history continues. And this continues, of course, because in some places invasions end. I mean, when the Mongols stop sacking the cities rebound somewhat. Transportation improves and becomes more reliable, as we've seen with the astrolabes and the caravanserai and the camel saddle. And of course, that increased trade leads to people needing places to trade and meet up and trade and produce goods. And that, of course, boosts the growth of cities like Venice here, one of the key trading cities of Europe. Better farming, too, increases the amount of food available. That, of course, increases the population, and a lot of that population winds up moving into cities, too. So urbanization continues as a trend in human history. Now, that said, even the most urbanized society on Earth in this time period, which was China, only had about 10% of the population living in towns and cities. The other 90% of people still lived in rural areas. But even in a still rural world, urbanization is a big story in this time period. So now that we've kind of laid the groundwork of where Ibn Battuta came from, the world of Islam, and how they traveled and what traveled with them on these trade routes, let's do a little traveling with them to visit some of these places in the global tapestry too. So let's start by following Ibn Battuta here on the Indian Ocean trade route. So we'll set sail here, and let's, like Ibn Battuta himself did, let's pay a quick visit here to the Swahili coast of East Africa, an interesting slice of the world in this time period. Partly because of the political organization. These weren't kingdoms here, but each one of these cities, and there were 30 some of them along the east coast of Africa, each one of these cities was actually its own independent state. The Swahili coast, one of the key examples of city-states in our 1200 to 1450 time period. Of course, the wealth and importance of these Swahili coast cities was based on trade. Captives, meaning enslaved people, ivory and gold being shipped out of East Africa to other parts of the Indian Ocean and beyond, porcelain, spices, and textiles being shipped in. So the shipping made these cities what they were. This was a place, thanks to the activities of Muslim merchants and missionaries, where Islam did catch on, at least for the elites. The rulers and the merchant class and the scholars of these cities generally followed Islam, but more traditional Bantu-style religions were followed by the majority of the population here too, but still it made them an important part of the Muslim world, Dar al-Islam. Let's remember too, Swahili Coast is one of the great examples of syncretism in world history too. Even the language itself, Swahili, was syncretic, taking cultural elements from here and cultural elements from there, mixing them together and make something new. Because, of course, Swahili, the language, is a mixture of Bantu, the Bantu languages from Africa, and Arabic introduced by the newcomers too, and written using Arabic script. I'll just footnote here that you might recall back in November, following the travels of yet another important traveler, kind of in this time period in the 15th century, the great Chinese sailor Zheng He and his massive expedition fleets. Let's remember that they too visited the Swahili coast coming from China as part of their voyages, which also involved a great deal of cultural exchange. Those Chinese voyages of Zheng He in the early 1400s reached the Swahili coast as well. South and Southeast Asia, as we ride the monsoon winds further around the Indian Ocean basin, we come to these two regions of the world, which are kind of lumping together here in this time period because there are some similarities in this time period. Both of these regions, South and Southeast Asia, at this time period are dominated not by huge empires, but by smaller and important states or empires, many of which have varied in their religious background. So let's take a look at our handy map here of South and Southeast Asia from Freemanpedia, and see that one of the important states to remember in South Asia, again, is the Delhi Sultanate, once again founded by invading Turkic peoples from Central Asia who had already converted to Islam, who managed to conquer much of northern India, set up a Muslim-ruled but still Hindu-majority state there in what's now northern India. In the south, meanwhile, there was another Hindu-ruled state, the Vijayanagara Empire there, reminding us that Hinduism continued to have royal sponsorship and champions in South Asia at this time period, a Hindu-ruled state. Of course, South Asia was also the cradle of another one of the world's great religions, Buddhism, which had largely vanished from South Asia in this time period, replaced by a resurgent Hinduism or Islam, except in one key place, Sri Lanka, where the Sinhala kingdom was established by this time period, a Buddhist-ruled and Buddhist-majority state. So a lot of political and religious diversity that Ibn Battuta would have encountered. Now, Ibn Battuta himself, he did live and work for a number of years in the Delhi Sultanate. That's where a number of his wives came from. But he was there in South Asia at the same time as these other kingdoms. Southeast Asia, too, is experiencing the same interesting mix of these three religions. As Islam arrives, joining Hinduism and Buddhism, which have already diffused and made their way to South and Southeast Asia and found champions among a number of states. The Khmer Empire here, centered in what's now Cambodia, the builders of the massive city of Angkor Wat there, they adopted Hinduism, used Hinduism as their state religion. Sriwijaya, another one of these great trade-based states here that ruled over Malacca for a while. The rulers of Sriwijaya adopted Buddhism, so there was again a mix of Hindu and Buddhist states there in South and Southeast Asia. The College Board wants you to know that mix of political entities and religious backgrounds there. And this is probably a good place here in South and Southeast Asia, where they're dominant after all, to stop and remind ourselves a bit about the Vedic religions, or Hinduism, as they're often called. There's Brahma, the creator god, one of the Trived of Hinduism there. Hinduism, like Judaism, one of the world's oldest religions. The teachings of Hinduism go back to the Rig Veda and other holy texts 4,000 years ago. Key beliefs, let's remember the key beliefs of Hinduism, now the world's third largest religion. Like Judaism, it's not only old, but it's also an ethnic religion, not universal or missionary. Because, of course, if you believe in the story of the castes and the caste system, you know that you're born in to this religion and this system. It's one of the world's major religions that believes in reincarnation, that you are reborn into another human life upon your death, in most cases, based on the karma, based on your accumulated record, if you will, of both good and bad acts over your life, determines where you wind up in your next life. And of course, the where you wind up has a lot to do with the caste system, which has, although this is a oversimplified version of the caste system, largely created by British rulers in the 19th century, some version of the caste system has dominated life in South Asia going back for thousands of years, and certainly in our 1200 to 1450 time period too. And important to remember that Hinduism in our time period, 1200 to 1450, was prevalent in South Asia. Most people in South Asia followed this belief system, and a significant number of people, though not a majority, in Southeast Asia did as well, especially in parts of what's now Indonesia and what's now Cambodia and Thailand at that time. But of course, the same way that that Judaism was the hearth for Christianity and for Islam, Hinduism was also kind of the wellspring of beliefs for this other offshoot religion, Buddhism. So we got to know this one too. The origins of Buddhism, of course, the teachings of the Gautama Buddha, who we see represented in this statue here, also known as Siddhartha Gautama, Prince Gautama, around 2,500, I'm sorry, about 2,500 years ago, that should say. So about 500 BCE was the life of Siddhartha Gautama. And he, as you recall, was the teacher of the Four Noble Truths, the great beliefs of Buddhism. First, that life is filled with suffering and sorrow, which we all know. Second, though, that the cause of all suffering is people's selfish desire for the temporary pleasures of this world. Maybe it only causes me suffering not to be able to go see you all at school because I desire to see you all at school. The way to end all suffering is to end all desire. So perhaps if I can stop desiring to see you all at school, this COVID-19 lockdown won't bother me anymore. And that the way to overcome such desires and attain enlightenment is to follow the middle way between desires and self-denial. We cannot give up all our desires, but nor should we give in to all of our desires. And of course, Buddhism has a much more rigorous description of how you might do this, but that's the sort of the nuts and bolts of the religion. In our time period, although it had largely vanished from South Asia, except Sri Lanka, it was a dominant religion by this time in East Asia, to which it had spread along with Buddhist missionaries and merchants before our time period, and much of Southeast Asia too, Srivijaya and modern-day Thailand and so forth. By our time period too, Buddhism had split into several sects or schools. There was Theravada Buddhism, the oldest form. In fact, Theravada means way of the elders, in which the focus is on the Gautama Buddha, the original Buddha, and his teachings, found mostly in Southeast and South Asia. And the more complex, perhaps, Mahayana, or Great Vehicle Buddhism, that developed mostly in East Asia and added on to Buddhism this belief in bodhisattvas, or multiple Buddhas, people who reach enlightenment but then who choose to stick around in a spiritual sense to help the rest of us. So while Theravada Buddhism is really focused on the centrality of the Gautama Buddha, Mahayana Buddhism welcomes in a whole host of Buddhas, of semi-divine beings to the religion to help human beings in their quest for escape from the cycle of death and rebirth, and also for help in just our daily lives. There's the Maitreya Buddha, one of the important bodhisattvas or other Buddhas honored in Mahayana Buddhism. Now, some clever people point out that this idea that people who have died can still help you out in your own life now, that this kind of echoes earlier ancestor worship beliefs or ancestor veneration beliefs in China. So perhaps this is a very syncretic form of Buddhism as well, Mahayana Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism, it's also a thing. It's from Tibet. It's the Dalai Lama. We don't need to go into it too much now. Now, speaking of things that move to East Asia, why don't we move along to East Asia as Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo both did? And at the start of our time period, 1200 CE or so, China has experienced yet another spin of the dynastic cycle, the cycle of dynastic thriving and decay, and then overthrow and replacement by a new dynasty, and had arrived by our time period at the Song dynasty, which were at this point well into a couple centuries into their rule here by the year 1200. This happens to be on the right, the Song dynasty Emperor Gaozong, who ruled around the year 1200, claiming, as Chinese emperors had done for millennia, the right to rule with the mandate of heaven. The idea that his family, his dynasty had been chosen by the divine forces, chosen by the gods to be the rightful rulers of China. And along with the mandate of heaven idea, the Song dynasty rulers continued, like the Tang dynasty and the Sui dynasty and the Han dynasty rulers before them, to utilize traditional methods of rule, the use of an imperial bureaucracy, for example, to administer their empire, and that bureaucracy selected based on Confucian ideals, which brings us here to the belief system to know, Confucianism. Yet another belief system to note. This one, not a religion. Remember, religions tend to have teachings about the divine forces of the universe, whether it's God or gods, or what happens to you in the afterlife when you die, as Buddhism does. Not Confucianism. Confucianism doesn't do either of these things, so it's not a religion, but it's certainly a belief system, originating with the teachings of Confucius, who lived, again, about 500 BCE, or 2,500 years ago. I have a mistake there, as I did with the Buddha. Sorry, guys. And the key beliefs of Confucianism, in a nutshell, are this: that humans playing their proper role in their relationships will lead to the establishment of a peaceful and orderly society right here on Earth. Forget the afterlife. We can make things pleasant right here on Earth if we all play our proper role, fulfill our obligation in our key relationships. And often these 5 relationships are ascribed to Confucianism, namely the relationship of ruler to subject, the relationship of father to son, from which partly through Latin comes this idea of filial piety, that younger people must give honor to older people and especially their parents, filial piety, the husband to wife relationship, the older brother to younger relationship, and the friend to friend relationship. And as we've noted, a lot of these are very hierarchical. In each one of these, except the last one, there's someone with more importance and status and one with less importance and status. So Confucianism does indeed support the idea of social hierarchy, but also of mutual obligations. You'll notice too that 3 of these 5 relationships are based around family. Confucianism, therefore, is a big supporter of family relationships and kinship. Also notice women appear only once here in a subordinate role as the wife. Confucianism, therefore, also a big underpinning to patriarchy in East Asian societies historically. And in our time period, East Asia was the place for Confucianism. It has never, even to our times, spread that much as a belief system outside of East Asia, but it is critically important to understanding the history of East Asia. But by our time period, 1200, Confucianism had coexisted with Mahayana Buddhism in East Asia for many centuries. The 2 belief systems, throw in Taoism too, 3 belief systems coexisting kind of symbiotically in East Asia and in China in particular. When he arrived in China, Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta were arriving in a society that had become, by the year 1200, by the time of the Song Dynasty, the world's economic powerhouse. No state on earth was more productive and more wealthy and more prosperous than Song Dynasty China. And here's our section from that Qingming scroll showing that market bridge in the city of Kaifeng with its bustling commerce and goods to buy and sell. I think this picture embodies pretty well the economic dynamism and commerce of Song Dynasty China. So why? Why was it the world's economic powerhouse? Well, a lot of it had to do with increasing commercialization. There's that word that means people making things, producing things, growing things to sell in markets like this one rather than to use themselves. And that tends to boost an economy. When people are producing more specialized goods, there tends to be more variety of things, better products to buy and sell. Commercialization. This economic growth was also based on, let's keep in mind, free peasant and artisan labor. This is one of the few places in our planet at this time period where coerced labor, whether slavery or serfdom or mita labor, was not a thing in China in any widespread way. So the people who grew the rice, who farmed the champa rice, who wove the textiles, they were mostly free laborers doing it for their own money. Expanded trade networks. Of course, China was linked to the Silk Roads, linked by sea to the Indian Ocean trade network, although albeit indirectly, but it was a great participant in the world trade networks of the time. The innovations in agriculture, for example, the introduction and propagation of champa rice from Southeast Asia, helped boost China's food supply, thereby boosting the overall economy, ensuring that fewer people actually have to be involved in food production, more can produce other goods, whether it's porcelains or silks. Innovations in manufacturing. Remember those dragon kilns, those sort of ramp tunnel-shaped kilns, which you could stack with literally tens of thousands of pieces of ceramics and fire them all at the same time. That was just one example of innovations in manufacturing that helped the Chinese to produce more goods than any other society on Earth, including these very important goods, steel and iron. This happens to be a diagram from a Chinese manual from the 1300s about how you can harness water power here to pump the bellows in your steel mill and make more steel than anywhere else on Earth. So keep in mind the great productive capacity of China. No wonder China had such influence, as it had in earlier centuries too, on its close neighbors, especially Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. So let's pay attention a little bit to China and its neighbors here, and how this was one of the key examples of cultural diffusion in our 1200 to 1450 time period. That in this time period, Japan and Korea were very much impacted by their centuries of interaction with China, and whose people had created syncretic societies, incorporating both indigenous Japanese and Korean elements, but also key elements of Chinese culture, including some elements of Confucianism, Mahayana Buddhism, as seen here in the giant Buddha of Kamakura, built in the 13th century, or cast in the 13th century, Chinese literary and scholarly traditions. I mean, the very fact of written language in China, or in Japan and Korea, reflects borrowing from China, although of course the Japanese and the Koreans both adapted the Chinese writing system to better suit their own needs. And we can kind of see that too here in the Kotokuin temple here in Kamakura, Japan, the influence of China in the Buddhism and the writing there helping to shape Japanese and Korean societies in both their artistic and literary traditions as well. But of course, by the time Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta arrived in China in the 14th century, the Song dynasty had ended, I guess it says, and China was now, of course, part of the Mongol Empire when they arrived. The origins of the Mongol Empire, of course, Genghis Khan, you can see him there in the lower right, who rose from barely the leader of a small band of people to the ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, certainly one of the key players in human history. The Mongol Empire, of course, so vast as Genghis Khan and his descendants used their combination of remarkable cruelty, persuasive force, and warrior know-how to conquer this vast swath of Afro-Eurasia. Of course, they had to adapt different rules of models of rule in different places. This map shows in green the extent, kind of the maximum extent of the Mongol Empire, including parts or all of East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe there, and the four khanates into which it was divided after Genghis Khan's death. The Empire of the Great Khan in East Asia, roughly, the Khanate of the Golden Horde in Eastern Europe, roughly, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, roughly, and the Ilkhan Empire in the Middle East, roughly, but all of them theoretically, until it all kind of fell apart after about a century, part of this massive Mongol Empire. There were very different outcomes too of Mongol rule in China, the Middle East, and Russia. Let's remember that. Of course, in China, the Mongol rulers dubbed themselves the Yuan dynasty, yet another dynasty in China's dynastic cycle, and the great Yuan rulers like Kublai Khan, seen here, adopted some elements of Chinese culture themselves while also maintaining some elements of their own Mongol culture. The Ilkhan rulers in Persia and the Middle East, they blended pretty quickly into the society there. They kind of they conquered Persia, and then Persia kind of conquered them, and they became Muslim themselves. You can see here from this primary source picture of Mongols in their tents learning to read the Quran, and then they kind of went on their way and left the rest of the Mongol Empire behind. And in Russia, the Mongol rulers just kind of kept to themselves, and Russian society to a large extent continued as it had before, although the Mongol rulers did empower certain Russian princes princes to kind of rule on their behalf and collect their taxes. So different models of rule there in the different parts of the Mongol Empire, but still very interconnected and enabling in that swath of Afro-Eurasia some things to move around a lot, even more than they had before. So we'll hone in on some particular Mongol examples of things moving around Eurasia in this time period. Historians sometimes use this term Pax Mongolica, which is Latin for the Mongol peace. This idea that for a time, the Mongols, having unleashed such deadly warfare, probably the deadliest per capita warfare in human history, they then established a time of great peace across much of Eurasia, when much of Eurasia was united under Mongol rule, and thus things became even easier to move around, including trade goods. This is a primary source picture, a painting commissioned by Kublai Khan himself of him out hunting, but you'll notice in the background he made pains to include a trade caravan too, illustrating the great favor that Mongol rulers held trade in. So they were great promoters of trade. Remember the Ortogs that they organized, those organizations of merchants to help make trade safer and more profitable on the Silk Roads. Technology too, like siege weaponry. Just one example of technology, how the Mongol rulers sought out the best engineers of the world, brought them to their courts, and hired them to build things like this, which the Mongols called the Islamic catapult. They hired Islamic engineers in the Muslim world to come introduce these new technologies to China. Cultural elements too spreading during Mongol rule. Buddhism, especially Tibetan Buddhism, spreading into Mongolia, where most people are still Buddhist today. Arabic numerals, they arrive in East Asia for the first time under Mongol rule and are actually adopted pretty readily there too. And as we've already seen, germs. It was, of course, in the even greater period of interregional interaction made possible by the Mongols that the bubonic plague spread so quickly throughout Eurasia and into North Africa. We've got to leave East Asia behind too, just like the Black Death did, and just like the Black Death did, follow Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo along the Silk Roads, you can see that included in their travel here, to arrive in Europe, another one of the world's key 1200 to 1450 civilizations that we haven't yet visited yet. And when we arrive there, we should ask ourselves a question. Who are the people in your neighborhood? In your neighborhood, in your European neighborhood? Who are the people in your neighborhood? At least religiously speaking. Because there's a lot of religious diversity. There's a certain extent, I should say, of religious diversity in Europe. Some of you might remember this primary source image from the 13th century from your DBQ back in November. It is of a Jewish person and a Muslim person playing chess. Indeed, in Europe, there were a fair number of Jewish people, especially in Al-Andalus, Spain and Portugal, largely ruled by Muslims, even into our time period, and Muslims too, largely in Al-Andalus. They were a minority. Most people, even in Al-Andalus, were not Jewish or Muslim, but there were significant Jewish and Muslim minorities there, and Jewish minorities throughout Europe, in Northern and Eastern Europe as well, especially the Ashkenazi Jewish communities sprinkled throughout Northern and Eastern Europe. But of course, as we know, the vast majority of people in Europe were like these guys here, these Catholic pilgrims following in the footsteps of St. Patrick here to visit the pilgrimage sites of St. Patrick in Ireland here. They were Christians, as most people were in that time period. Catholic Christians in Eastern Europe, Catholic Christians in Western Europe, like these guys, Orthodox Christians in Eastern Europe. Christianity was the dominant religion of Europe, which brings us to our final belief system to know, Christianity here. So let's check this out. As you well know, Christianity originates with the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth right around 2,000 years ago. Of course, our CE dating system is based on the old AD dating system, based itself on the life of Jesus. So we live in the year 2020 or so because it was about 2,000 years ago that Jesus of Nazareth was alive and preaching. And what did he preach? This stuff. Christianity, a universal, missionary, and monotheistic religion, the second chronologically of the Abrahamic religions to develop after Judaism but before Islam. but all of them teaching belief in the same God. Christian beliefs, though, are unique from Jewish and Muslim beliefs in believing that that one true God is divided, if you will, into three parts, the Trinity of Christianity. That there's God the Father, the creator of the universe, but there was also and is also God the Son, Jesus, who came to live on earth 100% God, but also 100% human at a particular point in time to bring salvation to the rest of us. And that, of course, that there's also God, the Holy Spirit, that part of God, which is all around the world, all around us all the time, and within us. This is the tricky part about Christianity, believing that God has these three parts all the time and that they're all 100% God. The other key teaching of Christianity, of course, is the idea that those who believe in Jesus as the Son of God and believe in Jesus' resurrection, his bringing back to life after his execution on the cross, shown here in this 13th century picture, that those who believe in those things will be saved from hell after they die, a salvational religion. And where were Christians to be found in this time period? Mostly Europe, where they made up a majority of the population, but also in Ethiopia, the East African kingdom, which was thriving at this time period and also had a Christian majority population, and significant minority populations of Christians throughout the Middle East, so notably in Syria and Egypt and present-day Iraq. So let's take a closer look at European society in this 1200 to 1450 time period. Whoa, check out that map. That's a lot of different states on that map. Especially when you consider that big kind of tan one in the middle. The Holy Roman Empire was really just a loose confederation of a whole bunch of little teeny tiny states and principalities. So yeah, Europe in this time period, a lot of political fragmentation, nothing like the political unity provided in East Asia by Song Dynasty China and then the Mongol Empire. It's a lot of fragmentation. And indeed, Europe was characterized by decentralized monarchies. Yeah, there may have been kingdoms like England and France and Burgundy and Denmark, but those kings, they didn't have a whole lot of power because feudalism ruled the day. So kings like King Edward the Confessor here of England, they relied on the loyalty and the military and service and the funding of the aristocrats who made up the elites in the countryside, in return for which he granted those aristocrats control of local lands in return. And those nobles or aristocrats, these guys here, they were the ones throughout Europe who controlled most of the land and people in countries like England, but had to give loyalty and service and funding to the kings in return. So kind of a balance of power here between the aristocrats in the countryside and the king. That's feudalism, very different from China, say, where the central government, the emperor, very much in charge and controlling things very effectively himself throughout the country with the use of a bureaucracy or a civil service. A very different setup here under feudalism. And perhaps this is because the land was so important in Europe. Europe, like most societies in this time period, relied on agriculture. Agriculture, or Europe, a largely agricultural society, dependent in its case on both free and coerced labor. Unlike China, where free labor, free peasants made up most of the workforce, yeah, it's true, as in this drawing here, the nobles had some workers who were free peasants who could choose to work in return for use of the land. But a lot of those workers, too, were serfs who had no right to leave the land owned by a particular noble or aristocrat and had to do the work commanded to them by that aristocrat, as seems to be the case here. So I don't know, these guys cutting the grain here, are they free peasants or are they serfs, coerced labor? I can't tell. But either way, that noble or aristocrat gets to boss them around and tell them what work to do. Hey, it's the manorial system. That's what this thing was, the sort of the key economic function of European society here, where the noble or the aristocrat gives these guys here some land or some protection from marauders, in return for which, there's the aristocrat, he gives these guys land and protection, in return for which they have to give him the labor to work on the land or to repair his castle or his manor house, or to take care of his livestock or whatever, and some of the crops and other goods, if they're weaving cloth on the side, they produce. That's kind of the key unit, this rural manorial system, named after the manor or the chunk of land owned by an aristocrat. So Europe, very much a feudal society, a farming-based society on this time. We have one more trip, one last trip to make here. Marco Polo never did this one, but Ibn Battuta did, proving he's the more boss traveler, on the trans-Saharan trade routes, or the sand roads. And this is kind of appropriate because this was the last of the major travels that Ibn Battuta made in his life before he also settled down to write up his memoirs. And he traveled at this time period on the trans-Saharan trade routes in the 1300s and arrived in the Empire of Mali there in West Africa along the Niger River, the latest in a series of states in the Sahel region of West Africa. And the Sahel refers to those areas where the Sahara Desert and the forested lands of the south kind of meet in this grassland savanna area where a lot of the key societies of West Africa have developed historically. And the latest of these by the 1300s was the Empire of Mali and its great trade cities, Timbuktu, Gao, and Djenné, along the Niger River. Of course, you might remember Mansa Musa, the king of Mali, who was reputed to be the richest person on earth at the time period. That's a European primary source image of Mansa Musa there holding a gold nugget there, because indeed his kingdom was quite wealthy in trade from salt from the Sahara Desert, where it was collected, gold from the forest lands to the south, and captives, enslaved people from the south, who were shipped north to the Mediterranean world to work as enslaved coerced labor, especially in North Africa and the Middle East. And the Empire of Mali kind of echoed the Swahili coast as a place where the elites, kings like Mansa Musa, merchants and scholars, adopted Islam, but most of the local people continued to follow their earlier animistic religions. Nevertheless, even today, you can visit the modern-day country of Mali in West Africa and see all kinds of hundreds of year-old mosques dating from this time period, the 1200s and the 1300s, like this, the Great Mosque of Djenné, built in the 1200s, which it's highly likely that Ibn Battuta visited as well. They didn't go everywhere, though, did they? Otherwise, this wouldn't be the pre-modern world, the pre-globalization world here in the 1200 to 1450 time period, because, of course, they did not travel here, where we are. They did not make it to the Americas. Had they found a way to do it, let's just make some quick note of some of the societies of the 1200 to 1450 time period in the Americas they would have encountered. In North America, they could have traveled in what's now the American Southwest and visited the ancestral Pueblo societies, Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde, for example, the ancestors of those who in the next era will go on to launch the Pueblo Revolt against Spanish rule. They could have, though they didn't, visit the vast territory of the loosely affiliated Eastern Woodlands or Mound Builder societies of what's now the Eastern United States, including Cahokia, a fairly powerful trading city in what's now Illinois. And they wouldn't have been able to visit the two most powerful states, or they would have been able to visit the two most powerful states of the Americas of this time period. In Mesoamerica, part of Latin America, the Mexica or Aztec Empire there in purple, and by far the most vast and populous of all the pre-contact American states here in the Andes region of Latin America, the Inca Empire. They didn't make it there. Had they made it, this is what they would have found, especially in those two powerful states, the Mexica or Aztec Empire. They would have been able to visit the massive capital city at Tenochtitlan, present-day Mexico City. There's a primary source image of it there on the left, built on islands in the middle of the lake there, in Lake Texcoco there in Mexico, in what's now Mexico City. Probably one of the largest cities on earth at this time period, certainly the largest city in the Americas. They would have found a society that drew on earlier cultural and political traditions of Mesoamerica, the Mayans and the people of Teotihuacan who came before them, things like writing. that glyphic writing, sacrifice-based religion, the same gods like Quetzalcoatl that the Mayan and the people of Teotihuacan had worshipped, the same ideas of political legitimacy of the emperor representing the gods on earth, and pyramidical architecture. So there's the writing, and there's some pyramid architecture adopted by the Mexica or the Aztec from earlier Mesoamerican peoples. Conquered peoples, people conquered by the Aztec, were generally not assimilated. They were kind of left alone so long as they paid their tribute. And maybe worth noting that trade in the Aztec Empire was left in private hands. That, like much of Europe and Eurasia, the merchants were private individuals making money for themselves. That's a contrast, as we shall see, with the biggest state of all in the Americas, the Inca Empire to the south. There's a primary source drawing of Inca farmers at work there. Like the Aztec or Mexica Empire further north, the Incan Empire was simply the latest in a long series of states and societies that developed in the Andes region of Latin America and South America. And like the Mexica, the Inca rulers also drew on earlier cultural and political traditions of earlier Andean civilizations, the Moche and the Chavin. They developed a very powerful state. Remember the mita system, the way that most common people in the empire were called upon to mita at certain points of the year and do work for the government. It's possible that these workers here are working on a sun farm, one of the state-owned farms that produced food for the Incan Empire. Cultural assimilation, another key part of Incan life here. That when they conquered people, they made an effort to teach those people how to speak Quechua, the Incan language, so that by the time the Spanish arrived, there were tens of millions of people speaking Quechua up and down the Andes, the Andes Mountains, and trade controlled by the government, not by private individuals. What was the benefits of being part of this overbearing, powerful state? One was crop sharing. I mean, the empire was so vast that they could easily move crops from one place to another and eliminate starvation. Even if there was a drought in the north, there were crops in the south, and they would move them around. How would they move crops around? On really boss roads like this one. Infrastructure built by common people as part of the mita system, but engineered very well, so much so that even today in a lot of Andean countries like Chile and Bolivia and Peru, people still use the Incan roads from centuries ago, and even in some cases the Incan bridges connecting the wild and rugged Andes mountains. And I think that's kind of it. Oh wait, is that you, Marguerite Kemp? That looks like Marguerite Kemp. You got something to say to us, Marguerite Kemp? Oh. Ooh. Oh. Oh, man. Marguerite, I feel just terrible about leaving you out. I'll tell you what. Next year, you get into the beginning of the presentation. Well, that's it, folks. Hope this helped. Best of luck. I'm going to join Marguerite here in wishing you best of luck on Thursday. Goodbye.